There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Elected Officials Forum. I want to start our meeting by first recognizing that we are conducting our business today on the territory of the Comox First Nation. And to this day, the Comox First Nation have not seceded, surrendered, or extinguished their Aboriginal rights to their title of land and waters. And we are very pleased to have a number of representatives of the nation participating and presenting today. These forums are a unique opportunity for us to connect with each other on topics of interest, to learn, share perspectives, develop common understanding, and in some cases, develop regional approaches. Oh, I think I can hear someone and someone's baby, perhaps. Yeah, as you're all aware, this past summer was one of the hottest on record, with widespread drought conditions and water scarcity. Water is central to life and central to what we do as local governments, but a changing climate is clearly threatening water resources across the globe and now here on the island as well. In the words of Maud Barlow, the destruction of aquatic ecosystem health and increasing water scarcity are the most pressing environmental problems facing humankind. We need to come together to discuss what is happening in our communities, what we are doing, and what can be done to protect our most precious resource. Today's session is focused on the Comox Valley watersheds, the local issues we are encountering, and the actions being taken by local governments, First Nations, and local stewardship and conservation groups. We're also going to hear about some of the initiatives being undertaken by our neighboring regional districts. In addition to the presenters, attending today's session are representatives from the CVRD, the City of Courtenay, the Town of Comox, the Village of Cumberland, Comox First Nation, the Ministry of Agriculture, Islands Trust, School District 71, and Ships Point Improvement District. My thanks to all of you for attending, and I hope you will find this session both informative and beneficial to all your work supplying, managing, and protecting water resources. I will now turn the floor over to Russell Dyson, CIO of the CVRD, who will be serving as moderator for today's session. Thanks, Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair Kepler, and welcome everybody. As moderator, you'll probably hear or see much of me today if everything goes well. I'm merely here to move things along, and we have a lot of information for you today. We have a number of guest presenters and members of staff that will provide some information to you, and it's broken up into 3 sections. After Hegus Rempel provides her perspective on water and that of Comox First Nation, we will look into the Comox Valley watersheds, and yes, watersheds, there's many of them, and the issues that they're being faced. We will then have a section where we look at some of the solutions that are being acted upon here in the Comox Valley. And finally, in the last section, we will look at regional districts south of us and some of the initiatives that they've undertaken. This event is being live streamed. We have also had an expression of interest, so there may be members of the public that are watching on as well. We will have a break. We hope that this break will happen at around 3 o'clock and give you 10 minutes to stretch your legs. During the first 2 blocks of presentation, I would ask that any questions be presented to me as a chat. In your Zoom, if you use your in your Zoom, you have the opportunity to provide chat under the chat function in the middle of the screen on the bottom. Please type in your questions of any of the presenters. At the end of their presentation, if time permits, I will try to have those responded to. But what we intend with enough time is at the very end of the meeting, we will have an open session to ask your questions specifically to any of the presenters or to provide some qualification. Again, I say we've got a lot on the table today. We hope to get through it all. And again, thank you so much for participating in this. And I just want to thank Jake Martins and all of our presenters that are part of this, that have put this together on rather short notice, but provided you with some excellent information. So please welcome Hegus Rempel from the Comox First Nation.
Thank you, Russell. JJ Hasach, Ima Taskoname, Cheche Hathach, Atathqual, Athamsgeje, Cheche Hatanapesh, Tegus Nicole Rempel, Bathtan. So good afternoon and welcome to the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. Today's forum on water is an issue that is very close to my heart. As many know, here in the Valley, Comox has taken a strong stance in water protection within our territory in the past 5 years. The commercialization of water is an issue I take as a personal affront to stewardship, and the greed for dollars is rapidly diminishing a precious resource worldwide. Because Comox believes in our duties as stewards of our lands, waters, and territory, we embrace the following 4 pillars: authority, jurisdiction, governance, and management over the natural resources within our Comox territory. As Jesse said earlier, there is nothing more sacred than water, and that's especially true to Comox First Nation. Whether it's marine water, surface, or groundwater, Comox has since time immemorial hunted, fished, and cultivated crops while maintaining a strong environmental, spiritual, and cultural connection to the waters within our territory. Life cannot exist without water. Our groundwater connects us to all that is integral to a healthy ecosystem. These ecosystems include animals, plants, and humans. Therefore, the value is immeasurable. With the inherent responsibility to steward our territory, the Comox First Nation takes great pride in respecting, conserving, protecting, and preserving the waters that flow above ground and below it. Comox Indigenous rights and title have a strong hold on the governance of water within our territory and is further supported by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the British Columbia Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act to ensure a continuous balance of conservation and protection and use and enjoyment by all who reside within the Comox territory. Water has been a key priority for Comox First Nation in our treaty negotiations with British Columbia. Comox is fully committed to building a relationship with BC and local governments on advancing reconciliation when it comes to water resources within our territory, and discussions around joint management of resource like water will benefit in the Comox Valley for all. Comox maintains its unique legal status in relation to lands and waters within our unceded territories, and insists that we are not merely watershed stakeholders, as we've been referred to in the past, but as a government that has its water rights protected through the Canadian Constitution. Indigenous rights include the right to fish, hunt, develop economically, and practice one's own culture. Items that we continue to work with and sometimes harp on with BC decision makers today when it comes to decisions on tenures through the Waters Act is that their mechanisms for decision making should include BC's DRIPA legislation. The following articles need to be considered by all levels of government with regards to the DRIPA legislation, and they are 8.2b, 11 to 19, 25, 26, 27, 28, 31, 32, and 38 of the DRIPA Act. Comox recognizes groundwater and surface water interactions are an important consideration in the governance, management, and stewardship of water within our territory, and consequently, we've invested resources in better understanding this relationship between the two with the assistance of GW Solutions in developing an internal report on water budgeting. The term water budget should be replaced with watershed health because that more accurately reflects the work that needs to be completed. The term water budget comes from textbooks and is commonly used in Ontario and somewhat reflected in a commodity-based and regulatory restrictive manner. In the recent Solemn River Watershed report, it recognized the fact that using the term watershed health instead of water budget was an example of how watershed protection activities could be indigenized, or a way that the CVRD can be respectful of KFN culture by incorporating Indigenous ways of being, doing, and relating into the project. The focus on watershed health is more reflective of the Indigenous worldview that everything is connected, that water is sacred, and that the watershed is a living system. It would be good to explore more ways that the watershed management activities can be indigenized. Moving forward, in our stewardship of watershed health, it will be important to consider some of the following. And many of these things the CVRD has been in discussion with Comox First Nation on. In particular, the different guidelines for forestry on Crown land versus private managed forest lands. As we know, there are fewer restrictions and environmental protections on privately managed forests. The desynchronization of water and the impacts of forest harvesting on groundwater recharge. With road development, new drainage, and forest harvesting on the hills, surface water now moves quite quickly over the ground and into streams. And because of this, water is spending less time on the land, and there is a loss of groundwater recharge. There needs to be more opportunity for recharging water in upper watersheds and across the landscape. Protection from commercialization of water resources from water bottling. We are fortunate to live in a place where the tap water is safe to drink. And why we are bottling and buying these resources is something that we should all be concerned about. Monitoring water quality for potential impacts from agriculture, vehicles and transportation, residential and commercial development, and other activities on the land. We need to take action to reduce wetland drainage. This can support groundwater recharge, protect aquatic health, and support migratory birds. And a roundtable approach to be used to bring people from all backgrounds to the table for these discussions. There's a lot of knowledge and passion for agriculture and watershed stewardship within the Comox territory. And by bringing people together to solve problems, we mobilize this knowledge and enable the local agricultural community, stewardship community, residents, the CVRD, local governments, and KFN to collaborate in protecting watershed health. We also need a review with British Columbia on a number of provincial statutes that include measures intended for drinking or for the protection of water quality, such as the Environmental Management Act, the Drinking Water Protection Act, the Forest and Range Practices Act, and in particular, the Water Sustainability Act. It is by working jointly with local governments, such as the CVRD, that we can collectively work together in conservation and protection of our most precious of resources. I want to thank everyone for attending today and for inviting Comox First Nation to this table and for holding this forum today and your leadership in addressing such an important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agus Rempel. We next move on to the Comox Valley watersheds and issues they're being faced with. I'm pleased to introduce 4 of our staff members that will provide a brief presentation each. Mark Rutten is the General Manager of Engineering Services and will provide an overview of the watersheds and their functions. A profile of Comox Lake will be provided by Zoe Norcross-New. We all know her as our watershed coordinator. Chris LaRose will be joined by Alana Mullally. They will provide a profile of Langley Lake in the Oyster River. And finally, Derry Monteith will provide a profile of the Solemn River. Mark.
Okay, thank you, Russell. I just went to share my screen, Jake, and it says hosts disabled participant screen sharing.
Thanks, Mark. Give it one more try if you can. Just see if it'll.
Yeah. Okay, it's working.
Okay.
Jake, can you just confirm that you're seeing the presentation screen?
Looks great.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Russell, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to just be providing a brief introduction to watersheds in general and to the watersheds of the Comox Valley. As part of this introduction, Alana is going to help me out with one of the slides here to speak about the CVRD's regional growth strategy and how it links to watershed health. I'm sure many of you already have a good understanding of what a watershed is and how it works, but I'm hoping to leave you with a few key points to take away into the rest of this afternoon's presentation. So a watershed is an area or ridge of land that separates water flowing to different rivers, basins, or seas. And this diagram shows some of the principles for how a watershed works. As you can see, rain or snow falls on the land. Some of that precipitation forms surface water, which feeds wetlands and streams. Some penetrates the ground to recharge groundwater, and some is evaporated back up into the clouds. Streams make rivers and lakes, and near the outlet of this funnel, large funnel, water eventually flows to the sea. Layered on top of this natural cycle are the many ways that humans impact watersheds, such as building dams and rerouting rivers, covering land for buildings and houses, timber harvesting, road construction, agriculture, drinking water, and recreation. These human activities all have an impact on the watershed and how it functions. Everyone in the world lives in a watershed, and watersheds know no political or jurisdictional boundaries. And our environment, economy, and society all depend on healthy watersheds. So this map shows watersheds of the Comox Valley. You can see, I hope you can see, I mean, it's a very busy map, but we're trying to show here that there are some very large rural and remote watersheds in the Comox Valley. There are some that are heavily impacted by farming and agriculture, and there are some that are small and urban. So there's a real diverse cross-section of watersheds throughout the Comox Valley, but they share many of the same challenges. From this map, you can see that watersheds do not follow any of our traditional political or jurisdictional boundaries, and this can make them very difficult to manage. Just focusing in on some of the smaller urban watersheds, it shows that their shape can be impacted by urban development. Watershed boundary lines can become straight as development and engineered drainage is implemented. Again, these small watersheds are also multi-jurisdictional. For example, the Brooklyn Creek watershed begins in Courtenay. It passes through the regional district and then ends in Comox. And that multi-jurisdictional feature can make them difficult to manage. You can also see here that part of the Solemn River watershed is within the city of Courtenay, and therefore the city can impact a watershed that is for the most part very rural and agricultural. The key point here is challenging. It's challenging for a single entity to manage a multi-jurisdictional watershed. I'm going to turn this slide over to Alana, who's just going to provide a link between the RGS and watershed health.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. So as you might know, our regional growth strategy is a broad vision enacted by bylaw of the board's 20-year vision for human settlement. It is future-oriented, and it can be used to guide the board in its decision-making. For example, the regional growth strategy can be used as a policy framework to assist local government in its consideration of how to strike a balance between planning watershed health and sustainability of any given water service. It can also be used to consider how and where to extend a service's infrastructure. Our regional growth strategy, adopted in 2010, aims to frame these questions within the principles of precaution, connectivity, and restoration. Our regional growth strategy includes a concept for regional conservation that is intended to inform coordinated growth management planning, including protection of natural systems. And as Mark said, these natural systems lend themselves to regional coordination as they don't abide our Western political boundaries. In this way, our regional growth strategy recognizes that very necessary relationship between planning for sustainable human settlement and watershed planning at that big picture regional level. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thanks, Alana. So thank you very much. That's it for our brief introduction. As we move on to the rest of the presentations, just want to leave you with the following question. If watersheds are essential, and if they know no political or jurisdictional boundary, and if issues tend to be common between watersheds, then what is the best way to manage our watersheds in the future? So thank you very much. And Russell, turning it back over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And we'll go directly to Chris LaRose. Oh, sorry, Zoe Norcross New. Chris, are you awake? Zoe.
No, actually, I'll load the presentation for Zoe. Just bear with me.
All right,
Are you now seeing the full screen of the Comox Lake watershed, Zoe?
I am.
Okay,
Everybody
excellent.
else?
All yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm Zoe Norcross now. The Comox Lake Watershed is probably the watershed that you've heard the most about in the Comox Valley. And the reason for this is that it's a fairly significant watershed because it supplies drinking water to approximately 50,000 people in the Comox Valley. And it's really the only supply of water for those people because we don't have a backup water supply for this water system. I should also point out that on this map, we chose to use the base maps, the maps of all of the watersheds of the Comox Valley, which in this case shows the Comox Lake Watershed as the Puntledge River Watershed and carries all the way down to almost to the estuary. So what I should point out though is that as far as the Comox Lake Watershed goes, the boundary is a little bit cut short of what you see there for the Puntledge River Watershed in that it only encompasses all the areas where the land directs water into Comox Lake, as that is our drinking water source. The Comox Lake Watershed is approximately 460 square kilometers in size and forms a fairly significant part of the total CVRD land area. It's almost about a third of the entire Comox Valley Regional District. Approximately 2/3 of the watershed is owned by private timber companies, and most of the remaining third is provincial parkland, and the CVRD has little direct authority or control over what takes place in the watershed. So this was the genesis of our collaborative approach to watershed management. Without the co-management of this watershed, each of the landowners and recreational users would be acting independently and largely for their own purposes. Next slide, please, Chris. So what are some of the key issues in the Comox Lake Watershed? As the chair referred to at the beginning of this meeting, climate change and climate uncertainty is probably one of the biggest factors. Changing climate has made rainfall and snowpack less predictable. In recent history, winter snowpack has provided a steady source of water inflow to the watershed during warm summer dry months. Climate models suggest that in coming decades, we will likely see significantly reduced snowpack, which will affect the timing of inflows and decrease the quantity of water available to us in the summer months. A projected increase in the magnitude and intensity of winter storms, on the other hand, will present conditions that will be conducive to exacerbating soil erosion and sedimentation, affecting water quality. And the heat dome effect we experienced in 2021 was a real eye-opener in terms of extreme temperatures that we can expect to see more of in the future. And it remains to be seen what the effect of these extreme heat events will be on our temperate rainforest ecosystems. The next issue I'm going to briefly talk about is the increasing recreation in the Comox Lake Watershed. Recreation in the watershed has been on the rise for many years, but the pandemic-fueled drive to find safe outdoor activities has pushed outdoor recreation levels to exponentially higher levels over the last 2 summers. The increase in human activity, coupled with the increased summertime drought and fire hazard, presents an elevated risk level to our watershed, particularly in terms of the risk of wildfire, which is one of the most significant risks that our watershed faces. And finally, moving on to industrial activity. Industrial forestry activity continues to take place on the privately owned lands occupying 2/3 of the Comox Lake Watershed. While current practices strive to meet or exceed industry standards, and industry provides significant resources to ensure protection from catastrophic wildfires, there remains a shortcoming in the legislation that guides forestry practices on private lands that leave our drinking water source in a vulnerable position. Next slide, please, Chris. This is related as another risk or an issue in the Comox Lake Watershed, which I'm just going to briefly describe. We're all aware that we have had challenges with boil water notices and sedimentation and turbidity in Comox Lake. The village of Cumberland's water is supplied from a series of reservoirs within the Perseverance watershed, which is one of the sub-watersheds of Comox Lake Watershed, which means that all the water in the Perseverance watershed does flow into Comox Lake. So in this diagram here, you can see there's some little green blobs, and those are the reservoirs that make up the Village of Cumberland's drinking water system. The blue line is a series of creeks that connect the uppermost reservoirs. And the yellow lines are areas that, creeks that water flows through, but that does not flow into the village's drinking water system due to the location of the intakes. And the red circle down below shows where the significant erosion that we've experienced in this watershed largely occurs. But back to the drinking water system. This system supplies water to approximately 3,700 people in the Village of Cumberland, along with bulk water sales to approximately 2,000 people in the Royston drinking water area, which is in CVRD electoral area A. To date, this water system has met the requirements for filtration exemption due to low levels of turbidity and E. coli, and a watershed control program that minimizes the potential for fecal contamination in the source water. Excess water from one of the small lake reservoirs, which is the third one from the left in this system, flows down a small stream channel, causing erosion of a large clay bank when water levels are high. And that area I'm referring to is the small red circle near the bottom. The eroded sediment from this area does not flow into any of Cumberland's reservoirs, but is instead carried into Comox Lake via Perseverance Creek, following that red line, which is another creek. It's part of the reaches of Perseverance Creek. A recent study by Tetra Tech concluded that over 97% of the turbidity reaching the CVRD's lake water intake originates from Perseverance Creek. The CVRD has been working with the Village of Cumberland to support the village's efforts in working toward a long-term solution to this erosion problem and to decrease the amount of sediment entering Comox Lake. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Zoe. There you go. So the CVRD manages in addition to the Comox Valley water system, the CVRD manages 4 water local service areas across the region. So those being the Black Creek Oyster Bay water system, fed by the Oyster River, shown on the left. The Union Bay water local service area since July 1st of this year, shown on which is fed by the Langley Lake watershed, shown on the right. And additionally, the Royston water local service area, which as Zoe just mentioned, is fed or supplied with water from the Village of Cumberland system. And then lastly, the Devon Island water local service area on Demon. With potential conversion processes underway to add Awatuko, which is a private water system, into the Black Creek Oyster Bay, and potentially conversion of the Graham Lake Improvement District system on Demon. So the Royston service area is roughly the same size as these two, but as I mentioned, currently buys water from Cumberland, so this is fed from the Perseverance Creek watershed. So the Oyster River, focusing on your attention onto the left graphic here, it's a large watershed that straddles the Strathcona Regional District and the CVRD. It's similarly to the Comox Lake watershed, it is mostly privately owned, with a little bit of overlap with the Strathcona Park at the far reaches. In addition to providing the primary summertime water source for the Black Creek Oyster Bay water service area, it supplies water to 1,000 connections in that service and about 2,500 people. It also provides water to a number of surface water licenses for agriculture and a fish hatchery, which are all upstream from the community drinking water intake. So the Oyster River flow slows dramatically in the summer, as there's no form of controlled storage upstream as there is, say, for example, in the Comox Lake watershed or even in the Langley Lake watershed, which I'll touch on next. So as I said, the flow does slow dramatically in that river. And generally speaking, we're less familiar with the Oyster River watershed as we have not yet undertaken a watershed protection plan. That may change soon. The Langley Lake watershed, it falls fully within the Hart Creek watershed, and it's relatively tiny at just about 400 hectares. Other than the lake itself, which is owned by the Union Bay Water Service area, the rest is entirely privately owned, and over 90% of that by a single forestry company, Mosaic. Langley Lake was formed by installation of a dam many, many years ago as part of the coal mining activity in that area. And the community of Union Bay benefits hugely from the storage capacity that's held behind that dam, as Washer Creek is typically dry for most of the summer. So key issues. So these are two very different watersheds. I'll focus on the differences before getting to the challenges they have in common. The Oyster River has no seasonal storage, as I just mentioned. So what that means is, for a community water system that relies on river flow, the frequency and duration of droughts is of serious concern without that ability to store water seasonally. Because as we all know, locally here, we don't have a lack of year-round precipitation. It's really just during the dry season. And without storage, we are really susceptible in a system like this to the frequency and duration of droughts. It's also multi-jurisdictional. So when we start thinking about any planning process like a watershed protection plan, and the effectiveness of such, and as has been highlighted to date, jurisdiction or watersheds no jurisdictional boundaries. Well, some of them have more jurisdictional boundaries than others, and that is a consideration in this one as well. It is split between the two regional districts. And lastly, in terms of a challenge that's peculiar to the Oyster, it's quite developed compared to our other watersheds. So the Comox Lake watershed that Zoe provided a summary of has relatively little, almost no development in the watershed. The Langley Lake watershed, zero development other than the industrial activity. But this one has a fairly large area of agricultural land, and then a settlement node at the far reaches. Langley Lake, the only challenge I'd like to highlight there is that it is a single private owner, which poses a challenge into in itself when considering a process like a watershed protection plan. And so as far as the challenges that these have in common, both are facing the prospect of significant growth. Major developments in both areas appear to be finally moving forward after very long planning stages. While BCOB could very well double in size over the coming decades, the situation is even more pronounced in Union Bay, where a single development could quadruple the size of the existing system. And the reality is that beyond infrastructure constraints, which can be, arguably relatively easily resolved, both services are constrained by the size of their surface water licenses. In Black Creek Oyster Bay, that's pushing us to explore sources away from the river, making use of groundwater that isn't on its way to the Oyster River. And Union Bay has much more room in their surface water license than Black Creek, which is fortunate because an alternative source similar to the groundwater doesn't really exist in that area. So along with every other water system on the eastern coast of Vancouver Island, planning for both of these are significantly impacted by uncertainty about the local impacts of climate change, as Zoe also highlighted. And again, just like almost every other water system on the southeast coast of Vancouver Island, working with the legacy of the ENN land grant and the private forestry activities is arguably the most impactful human activity within these watersheds. And finally, while the ones I've highlighted are the largest, I'd be remiss in not touching on the other drinking watersheds in the Comox Valley, with most of the rural areas fed from individual wells tapping into their local aquifers. These aquifers were under particular strain this year after the very hot and early start to the summer dry season. And many rural residents reported much lower than average groundwater levels, with many wells running dry. Bulk water sales from the Comox Valley Regional District standpipe near the farmers market were up significantly, and there were specific rural areas that generated a number of calls to us inquiring about the prospect of extending community water systems outside of their existing bounds. And these are areas that we had not previously heard anything from or regarding water shortages. Now I'll pass you over to Derry Monteith to talk to you about another important CVRD watershed.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. So the Solemn River watershed is a rural watershed. It's approximately 248 square kilometers in size and is relatively low in elevation. It includes upland forest areas and low-lying residential and agricultural lands. The Solemn, much like the Oyster River that Chris just discussed, and many other rivers on the east coast of Vancouver Island, really experiences extreme seasonal fluctuations in flow, with very high flows in the winter and very low flows in the summer. And during this last summer, we saw an example of this extreme summer low flow and drought. Wolf Lake, which you can kind of see is the depressed area in the center of the map there, is the largest lake in the watershed, and it really acts as an important reservoir, storing water to be released during times of low flow. And this water is stored under license for conservation purposes held by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. The majority of the land in the watershed is privately managed forest that is actively logged, and changes in land cover and drainage in the upper watershed have been observed to influence hydrologic regime of the watershed. Land use within the lower reaches of the watershed is primarily agricultural, with approximately 72 square kilometers of ALR lands within the watershed and almost 300 farm properties. There is a very long history of food production in this watershed, and agriculture really plays an important and growing role in the community in the Solemn. Agriculture is the primary consumptive user of water in the watershed, with irrigation accounting for the bulk of surface and groundwater use. It's estimated that irrigation accounts for over 90% of licensed consumptive surface water use and over 80% of groundwater use. Aquifers play a very important role in water supply in this watershed. Overall results of a recent watershed health assessment indicate that approximately 3/4 of water demand in the watershed is provided by groundwater. And additionally, in the driest months, groundwater is really a key contributor to the stream and surface water flows in the Solemn. There's also a highly dedicated and engaged stewardship community in the Solemn. The Solemn River Restoration Society actively works to improve channel conditions, enhance riparian areas, and monitor flow and fish populations. And the KFN is also an active participant in watershed stewardship in this watershed, also participating in monitoring and restoration activities. So next slide, please, Jake. Thank you. So access to water has really been identified as a major obstacle that faces the agricultural sector in this region. The Comox Valley really has one of the most favorable growing climates in the country, and there is still a relatively large amount of farmland that is available in the Solemn. However, access to water is currently a limiting factor for production. Climate change and future growth in agriculture will place further demands on surface and groundwater resources in this area. And an assessment of future agricultural water demand recently completed showed that agricultural water demand under projected 2050 climate conditions could increase by 3-fold to 7-fold. So with climate change, it's also likely that the water needs of existing producers will also increase. So not just new production. With longer, drier summers, many producers who did not irrigate in the past have recently discovered that they need to begin irrigating their crops. KFN has shared with us through engagement in some planning activities that they have concerns about this increasing water demand without fully understanding the watershed system in the Solemn. And there is concern that additional water use and worsening water scarcity could compromise KFN's access to water in this area. More really needs to be done to proactively address potential future growth in agricultural water demand in the Solemn, while also considering aquatic health and the needs of other users in the watershed. And this is recommended to include more support for producers in water storage and land stewardship. Historic stream flow data really shows the value of augmentation in the watershed, so the value of the Wolf Lake Reservoir. In recent drought years, even with augmentation from the Wolf Lake Reservoir, however, August flows have dropped to extremely low levels, affecting fish and aquatic life. And further work is really needed to quantify the flows and conditions required to maintain ecosystem health in the Solemn. So water use and availability data gathered and analyzed to date have really validated concerns about present and future water supply for agriculture and in-stream flow needs in the Solemn, really highlighting the potential for water use conflict in this area. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Russell, I guess.
Thank you very much, Derry, Alana, Chris, Mark, and Zoe. You did a phenomenal job. Not only give us tons of information, but in a very short time as well. And you've put us ahead of schedule. There was one question or comment provided in the chat, and I'll give a summary of that. But I'd like to encourage everybody, please, if you have some questions right now, add them to the chat room, and we'll try and get through those. And the first is a comment and question, I think, from Richard Hardy of the Comox First Nation. And in response to some of your comments about watershed monitoring, so Richard was pondering about the need for additional monitoring, not only in our watersheds, but also in consideration of groundwater. So do any of the panelists have any comment on that? And I think Richard was also encouraging that maybe with monitoring, there needs to be a little bit more regulation or enforcement and management of our water source. So put that thought and questions to any members of the panel's comment.
I can take a go at it. Maybe ask Zoe if she has anything after to speak to. You know, our in terms of groundwater, the Black Creek Oyster Bay is the only service area that uses groundwater to any large extent. So we have developed a very large data set of that groundwater resource over the years as we've been managing it, and especially over the last 5 when we've rolled out our computerized data tracking system, SCADA. So we do have a very large data set there that's available. If there's any interest in, we can certainly share that information. And then otherwise, we don't have a direct authority or mandate for groundwater monitoring. If anybody else has anything to mention on that. Derry, was there any groundwater monitoring aspect to the work done in the Solemn River watershed?
Yeah, certainly the need for groundwater monitoring was recognized and was one of the primary recommendations that came out of that work.
Thank you. And any comments, Zoe, at all to add to that as well?
Regarding groundwater, I don't have any comments. We have not looked at groundwater in the Comox Lake watershed other than at the landfill, where the interest was whether or not groundwater was moving towards or away from the lake. And this was not through my work, but it was through the landfill, the solid wastes department's work, where they were able to confirm that the groundwater at the landfill is moving away from the lake. But apart from that, like monitoring groundwater levels is not something that I've been involved with at all.
Okay, thank you very much to each of the panelists for your response. I see that Tim has his hand up. I'll come to you in a moment, Tim, but I'd just like to read out a comment that Director Arbour has in response to Mark's question. Good on you, Mark, for asking questions and getting everybody to think. So Director Arbour says that about Mark's question about how to best manage watersheds, his suggestion is that we don't have enough control. Maybe the CVRD should consider a community forest at a regional scale, building on Cumberland's work. The private companies and the province have clearly failed communities along the east of Vancouver Island. So thank you very much for that comment, Director Arbour. I'll now go to Tim Ennis. And if anybody else has questions, given that we have this little bit of time, we'll also receive your hands up. So please don't hesitate to do that or add your questions to the chat room. So Tim, please go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I just wanted to respond to Richard's question. A few years ago now, thanks to the leadership of the Comox First Nation, they hosted a summit or a workshop around climate adaptation in the community. And one of the outputs from that workshop was pointed to the need for systematic water monitoring valley-wide throughout the region from one end to the other. And we know that this is happening in a sporadic, haphazard way. Most of the water quality data outside of the Comox Lake Watershed, perhaps, is being collected by conservation organizations and streamkeepers groups. So with that in mind, our Comox Valley Conservation Partnership, which I'll be speaking to later, has a plan to re-engage with Comox First Nation, KFN, and look to operationalizing a more systematic approach to water quality monitoring, including one data repository where all of that stuff can go. So this is something that you'll probably be hearing from myself and hopefully others at KFN more about in the coming months, but it's a very high priority for our groups. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Tim. And I see Mayor Wells has a comment in the chat, but also has his hands up. So I'll go to you, Mayor Wells, and you can comment on what you have in the chat.
Thanks. Sorry, I was getting confused if I had to put the question there or if I could put my hand up. So I'll kind of do a shotgun approach here. So this was a conversation that had happened years ago, but maybe the time's come to push it again, and that's looking at revenue sharing, which is done. We are in I think what most of us would feel is a somewhat unfortunate situation where the forestry companies kind of own our watershed and are harvesting it. And in other parts of the province where there's the ability to make revenue off of resources, that revenue in northern BC is actually shared with municipalities. And to look at that as a possible benefit, if we could do that, because then, even if those that revenue sharing had some strings tied to it, that it had to be used for the betterment of the watershed or whatever it happens to be, that might be a worthwhile endeavor. And I'd be happy to facilitate a letter or anything like that, if that'd be helpful.
Thank you very much for that, Mayor Wells. I would also like to let the group know that the Regional District Board initiated a resolution a number of weeks ago or months ago to direct staff to coordinate meetings amongst those on Vancouver Island that are managing water systems, water supplies on private managed forest lands. So not only the Comox Valley, but of course the city of Port Alberni, the city of Nanaimo, Regional District of Nanaimo, and others are in similar situations where our watersheds are managed by a private forest company. To initiate that action, there will be a meeting of staff here shortly amongst those various municipalities and regional districts to try and look at a coordinated approach, with ultimately the intention being to bring the political leadership of those organizations on Vancouver Island together to see what are the initiatives that they see are in common for acting on this in the near future. We have a comment from Director Hamir. Farmers in the Coquihalla watershed were given last minute notice that their water licenses were being revoked. Coquihalla, for those that may not know, is in the Cowichan Valley Regional District. So they were going to be revoked from the river. Has the province indicated that this might happen in the Solemn? How many farms would be impacted? Derry, do you have any knowledge or understanding of through your work as to the possibility of that happening here?
Yeah, I know that, during this last drought this summer, the Solemn was under a fairly high drought rating 5, which indicates that, regulatory action could take place in the Solemn. However, I haven't heard from the province of any indication that this might happen.
Great, thank you very much, Derry. Anyone else, Mark or others, provide any further information? Okay, thanks. I'd just like to note that Mayor Bob Wells has provided a link for UBCM to resolutions database with respect to revenue sharing local government that he previously spoke to. I also see a comment from the CAO, Jeff Garbett from City of Courtenay, that staff from the Cowichan Valley Regional District can speak to it potentially. That's probably with respect to the Coquihalla issue. And thank you very much for that suggestion, Jeff. Daniel Arbor, Director Arbor, good suggestion, Mayor Wells. I would rather have communities become owners of the watershed. Revenue sharing may make us complicit in practices we may not like. If the companies agreed to the FSC certified and reduce their cut rotation by at least 50%, I would consider revenue sharing. And FSC, there's one of that is one of a number of different certification, voluntary certification means that are available to private forest companies. I believe that Director Arbor is referring to there. We still have a little bit of time before we go to our break at 3 o'clock. Is there anybody else that might have anything to share or comment on? And I maybe prompt Councillor Richard Hardy, whether you have anything to add with respect to your comments and the answers that you heard.
Yeah, I'm good. I guess the question I was asking Zoe in regards to the 4 issues that she had brought up is whether or not we should consider water monitoring in the Comox Valley watershed an issue in regards to whether or not we have or are doing enough monitoring of surface water and groundwater. So that was the issue that I was asking if it should be considered or not. The other comment I guess I would have, and Derry, thanks for your presentation. I guess a concern of mine would be again with regards to the Solemn River watershed. And if anybody's read that report or not, it talks about the use or increase in water by about 715% by the year 2050. So that's a very alarming number when we turn around, we look at what's transpired this summer. And again, just thinking about water health for not just the Solemn River watershed, but all the watersheds moving forward. If there's a 715% increase with the Solemn River watershed, what are the likelihoods of increases or impacts on other watersheds throughout the valley moving forward here? So just things to take into consideration when we're thinking about water health in our territory.
Great, thank you very much, Councillor Hardy. And Director Hamir, I see that you have your hand up.
Thanks, Russell. And I just want to echo that concern that Councillor Hardy just mentioned about the Solemn River watershed and not the other watersheds that are also really reliant on groundwater. One issue that's really concerning me is, and it may not be on everybody's radar, but the recent decision by the Agricultural Land Commission to enable more than one house to be built on every property in the ALR means that, potentially we could be doubling the number of houses that have an impact on primarily aquifer. And we really don't have much power, I guess, or maybe we do. I don't have the answers here, but it's certainly something that is concerning me is how do we protect our groundwater as well as our surface water in light of that, the fact that, not all of those people moving onto ALR land would be farmers. There's no requirement for them to be. So just, want to put that forward as a concern that we may need to think about.
Thank you very much, Director Hamir. Yes, and the size of some of those homes that are being built, not necessarily within our regional district as of yet, but other areas of the province, when they're pushing 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 square feet for homes on ALR, and to contemplate that may be able to be accomplished with 2 now. And the chair of the Land Commission would probably remind me that it is the province that actually adopts the regulations rather than the Land Commission themselves. So just a small detail. Thank you very much, Director Hamir. And next I see Zoe has her hand up.
Hi, yes, I wanted to apologize that I had to briefly step out for a moment when the question was asked about the Comox Lake watershed. And so can I have an opportunity to quickly answer that, or are we out of time for that?
No, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay, can I repeat what I understand of the question? Is there enough being done to monitor the water quality in the Comox Lake watershed? Was that the question?
That's a good question for you to address. Yes, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the amount of data that we have been collecting in the Comox Lake watershed has been pretty extensive, as far as we're looking at all of the tributaries to the Comox Lake, and also during times of storms and high turbidity episodes. And I do feel that the data has shown us that for the most part, we really don't have currently any significant issues in terms of water quality, except for with the Perseverance Creek. One thing that we are hoping to better understand with some of the equipment that we're looking at that is monitoring snowpack in the mountains and rainfall, is to better understand issues that may come up in terms of water quantity in the future. But as far as water quality goes, I feel like we do have a fairly good grasp of that in a fairly broad sense for the Comox Lake watershed, and have not been alerted to anything that is of significant concern at this time. Does that help? Does that better answer your question? Or
Yeah, sorry, Zoe. I think what I was asking was in general in the Comox Valley, when we start looking at all of the watersheds that we have in our territory, whether or not water monitoring is an issue or not, and should we be focusing on that to kind of better understand our water health today in comparison to where we're going to be 10 or 20 years from now, when we start looking at regulation and management and enforcement of the water resources within the region. I see right now a lot of licenses are being allocated for water, not really understanding where we are today with regards to water health and where we're going to be 20 years from now with regards to water health. So that was the real question that I was asking.
okay, thank you.
So,
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Zoe, and Councillor Hardy. I just got Director Grievous here in the room has a question, and we'll go to him, and then probably one more from Director Arbor, and then it'll be time to carry on. So, Director Grieve.
Thank you very much. Once again, as I keep harping on about the fact we are not masters of our own house, and we have the Fisher-Price level of control over our watersheds. But from what we know, for a long time now, we're looking towards longer, hotter summers and shorter, wetter winters. So I guess the question is, how do we actually capture and retain water? We talk about recharging aquifers, and that's just not going to happen until the forests grow back. So we need to find a way of incentivizing agricultural dugouts, et cetera. And in the bigger picture, we maybe need to look at something a lot more on a grand scale, like actually damming maybe the oyster so that you can smooth out the flows, maybe the crookshank, something like that. This may be beyond our time on the planet, but I think those days will come. You have to have some really big solutions to some of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Grieve. And one more quick question or comment from Director Arbor. Then there's a few things in the chat that I'll inform you of. So, Director Arbor.
Yeah, thanks. I finally figured out how to make my my mic work. I was struggling with it. Some really good. I look forward to the next hour. Some really good conversations. I think it's a global issue as across all of our jurisdictions. This summer on Hornby, we were really on the forefront of wells drying. So many reports. Obviously, historically a dry area. And I think I agree with Dr. Grieve, like not shying away from looking at the bigger solutions for the long term and really thinking about water as this precious resource across the entire valley. We probably have 20,000 people on wells. It's just such an important resource to think about for the future. And when Dr. Grieve talked about the big solutions, and I mentioned earlier, perhaps working towards more ownership with Comox, I see there's the comment from Chief Rempel coming up, but other jurisdictions have achieved that. Sometimes big things seems big before you embark on the journey. We've seen a number of First Nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island become the owners of their TFL. And that allows them to align their values better with forest management. It's not always perfect, but now they're in the driving seat. We have communities and countries around the world where forests are publicly owned and publicly managed. There's many examples. So I think in a climate context, we shouldn't shy away from questioning a failed model of ownership that has existed for the last 150 years and is still very benevolent to the kind of colonial mentality of past times. So myself, I'd be excited if we talk with other regional districts about bigger long-term solution rather than maybe having this forum every year and just complaining about our lack of control. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Arbor. Just like to raise a number of links that have been provided through the chat. Thank you very much to James Warren, has provided a link to the Solemn River Watershed Plan that Derry has referred to. Please have an opportunity to take a look at that. And we really appreciate the participation of the community and in particular Comox First Nation with respect to their input on that project. So a very good report to have a look at. Mayor Bob Wells has also provided a link to some other information. There is a question about Langley Lake and Union Bay Estates. Union Bay Estates is the development proceeding in the Union Bay area. And they have an agreement which was struck with the previous improvement district that the regional district is now responsible for, as we've assumed responsibility for the water system, that Langley Lake will be the supply of that development. And the developer was required to provide various improvements to the water system. For instance, the next phase of upgrade to the treatment works to ensure that an adequate supply can be provided for growth in the community. And then finally, just to draw attention that Agus Rempel has provided a comment. As municipalities want to consider revenue sharing, bear in mind that First Nations and the Comox First Nations have been trying to work on this for decades, generations with the province, and there's some consideration to be given to the rights and title that First Nations might have. So just something to bear in mind. So it's now just shortly after 3 o'clock. We're going to take an 8-minute break. We're going to break until 3:10, if that's all right with everybody. But please go and stretch your legs, walk outside and feel water in your face. It's raining. And come back and join us in about 8 minutes, and we'll carry on with this. So thanks for your participation so far, and we'll see you in 8 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. It's now just 3:11 and we'll get started with the next section of the workshop. And now we're going to take another look at the Comox Valley, but look at some of the things that are being done. And the panel for this part of the section, we will be joined by the Comox First Nation Guardian Watchman Program, and Candace Newman will be here to tell us a little bit about that. Crystal Rose will join us again to talk about some CVRD programs, including natural assets, water conservation, watershed protection, and advocacy. And we will also be joined by Tim Ennis, Executive Director for the Comox Valley Land Trust. And Tim will talk about conservation partnerships. So without further ado, I bring on the next panel members, and starting with Candace.
Hi, everyone. My name is Candace Newman. I'm a member of the Comox Nation, and I work for the Comox Guardians. So this summer, we had the opportunity to collaborate with the ministry, specifically Sarah Hardy from Flinro. And this was on a multi-year water usage study on the Solemn River, and that's during the low flow season. The objective of the study is to get baseline data of how much water is flowing in the Solemn River, specifically above the water, most of the water users, and to understand and to help understand how much water is being used on the Solemn River. So in mid-June, we installed a stream flow monitoring station, and that is under the McEachern Bridge on Fitzgerald Road. And at that location, we installed a a real-time continuous sensor that's in the stream, and a staff gauge. We also installed a barometric pressure gauge on the side of the river there. This was also, we visited the site every 2 weeks after we installed that data logger to take manual discharge measurements, and that was with flow tracker. This did discharge and water temperature. We chose this location because it's easy access point and above most of the water users. Unfortunately, that data is not available right now on Aquarius, but Sarah was able to upload our manual readings on Aquarius, and that location has been uploaded on there as well. So I can, maybe in the message there, I can put the link into that. And then eventually, so we've taken the site down now because the flows have been getting a bit strong in the stream. And so next year when we install it again, then all of that real-time data will be available on that Aquarius BC government website. Also next year, we will be installing the similar setup lower in the system, and that will help inform as well on water usage on the Solemn. And unfortunately this year, we don't have enough baseline data to do a rating curve, but hopefully next year, Sarah will have that information as well. Yeah, so that's basically all that I've partaken on the Solemn River watershed this year.
Thank you very much, Candace. And we'll now go to Chris LaRose.
Thank you, Russell. Bear with me while I share my screen. Can you see that, Russell?
Yes,
Russell, can you see my slide? Okay, great.
Yes, all good.
Excellent. Yeah, as alluded to earlier this afternoon, development and implementation of the Comox Lake Watershed Protection Plan is the biggest watershed-based initiative currently underway at the CVRD. Given the multi-ownership and governance nature of the watershed, when we were directed by the province back in 2013 to develop a watershed protection plan for the service, we opted to convene a watershed advisory group to help guide development of the plan. So the WAG, as it's referred to, is composed of approximately 25 members, including representation from the Comox First Nation, the landowners within the watershed, environmental stewardship groups, recreational associations, elected officials, and local government staff. So the WAG was initially tasked with development of the plan, but it did evolve to help guide implementation as well after the plan was received by the Comox Valley Water Committee in 2016. So the Watershed Protection Plan was always envisioned to be a live document. And as we are now 5 years into implementation of the plan, and we've experienced some significant changes, including the construction of a new water treatment plant, which is just coming online now. We are undergoing a review of the original risk assessment so that it can be updated to accurately reflect the current risk levels. So while some of the faces on the advisory group have changed, engagement by the WAG participants remains really high, which is great. There's consistently strong attendance at the primary meetings, but also the subcommittee meetings that were formed to provide input and oversight respectively to education and outreach, water quality monitoring, and emergency spill response. Those three being the kind of the biggest areas of activity, in turn reflective of the most significant risks that were identified by the risk assessment, which forms the backbone of the Watershed Protection Plan. While not formally a subcommittee of the WAG, a committee with very similar membership as the WAG was formed to help guide development of a study in partnership with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which is a Canadian nonprofit. The objective of this work, which started in 2018, was to develop a asset management plan for the Comox Lake watershed. Under the concept of a natural asset, so that taking advantage of or leveraging the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative expertise and experience with natural asset management elsewhere in BC and in Canada, to apply a very similar methodology to that used for engineering assets to the incredible natural asset that is the Comox Lake watershed. So natural asset management uses many of the same terms and concepts as engineered asset management. You know, there's an asset inventory, but instead of inventorying pumps and pipes, it's wetlands and creeks and lakes and other key aspects of that watershed, which play a role in catching the water, in conveying the water, in filtering the water, through biological and mechanical activities. There's an asset condition assessment, so a rigorous process to go through to assess the condition of those assets. A risk assessment, which will largely be drawn from the work that's already done through the Watershed Protection Plan. And additionally, in addition to those kind of areas covered by the engineered asset management, and an acknowledgement of the very different nature of natural assets, maybe drawing your attention back to that, that concept that was first mentioned by Mark earlier in the session, that that watersheds know no jurisdictional boundary, and not only jurisdiction, but different ownership models as well. So this process acknowledges and undertakes a rigorous qualitative analysis of co-benefits to understand how each of the various activities or within the watershed positively or negatively impact delivery of clean source water for the community drinking water system. So the work is still ongoing and has since been kind of refocused on the Perseverance Creek watershed, given the massive scale of the Comox Lake watershed. One of the key objectives of the work is to develop a template for the process and the resulting report that, once completed, can be extended to the rest of the watershed, either in one step or potentially, by going to the next and most significant sub-watersheds, such as the Cruikshank, but also to any other watershed in the Comox Valley or further to the MNAI's key objective, which is elsewhere in Canada. So we expect the work to help prioritize areas of protection and restoration within the watershed. It should help us to better understand the value that the watershed provides to the Comox Valley water system, and help support continued investment in watershed protection, including education and outreach, to help us reduce our collective impact on the watershed directly through recreational activities, but also indirectly through water conservation. So the Connected by Water initiative, which is the key output from the education and outreach component of the Watershed Protection Plan, was developed as a direct output from the planning process in order to build capacity, community, and connection to support watershed protection and water conservation efforts in the Comox Valley. There are a broad range of projects currently underway, with one of the most notable being the place-based watershed curriculum for SD 71. So the Connected by Water team has developed inquiry units for K-3 and 4 to 7, and most recently for high school grades 8 and 9. The demand has been so high, in fact, for these units that additional kits continue to be added to the Learning Resource Center that's available to all teachers. The kits are in those grades. The kits are currently being translated into French to widen their impact. And other initiatives recently completed or underway include watershed guidebooks and training for recreation leaders in the community, special event protocol development for events held within the watershed, watershed protection collaborative initiatives, and exploring the potential for a Comox Lake Watershed Ambassador program to help spread the word out on the ground, so to speak, during the summer, coming into contact with people who are recreating and using the watershed. So water conservation continues to be a focus of the CVRD, with uptake on the toilet rebates starting to dwindle. The focus turned a couple of years ago to ways to address that tripling of water consumption during the summer months. Smart irrigation controllers have been shown to reduce outdoor water consumption by as much as 20 to 40%. And we're planning to roll out an additional rebate for soil amendments that'll be added in 2022. As appropriate application of topsoil and mulch has been definitively shown to significantly reduce summertime water use by allowing more water to be stored in the beds and on the lawn between rains. So the CVRD continues to advocate for improved regulations for forest harvesting, as has been touched on a couple of times during this afternoon's discussion. So for every engagement opportunity provided by the province around forestry regulations, the CVRD has prepared science-based responses, strongly advocating for higher standards and accountability for industrial harvesting in the watershed, particularly within our drinking watersheds. And finally, for the rural area water service areas, the CVRD water staff are working closely with our engineering consultants and the CVRD planning staff to develop water master plans for the Black Creek, Oyster Bay, and Union Bay water systems. So the focus of this work is to understand what improvements are required to the distribution and the source water infrastructure to accommodate the significant growth that's anticipated in both areas. So these studies are expected in early 22 and will help guide decision-making by staff and by elected officials about how and when growth can be accommodated in these communities. The situation is particularly acute in the Black Creek Oyster Bay water service area, where an informal new connection suspension has been in place since late last year, just given the concerns about the available capacity to meet the existing demand. So from a watershed protection perspective, staff are working on the terms of reference for a watershed protection planning process for the Oyster River watershed, and we're currently reviewing the watershed protection plan that was developed independently by Mosaic for the Langley Lake watershed, working to understand whether and if the CVRD-led watershed protection plan is warranted there or not. Every connection within all 4 of the CVRD water systems is metered with a conservation rate structure in place to help incentivize reduced water consumption. So escalating water restrictions are tied to water availability and have proven very effective at reducing summertime demand during times of drought, such as this summer. So that's it from me. I'll hand you back over to Derry again to touch on another CVRD-led initiative. Over to you, Derry.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so in 2018, the CVRD secured grant funding from the Investment Agriculture Foundation for the purposes of completing phase 1 of an agricultural watershed planning study for the Solemn River watershed. And the phase 1 planning process was completed throughout 2018 and 2019. And it really involved gathering and interpreting existing data and knowledge, community engagement with the Comox First Nation, and recommendations for phase 2. So the phase 2 work was then initiated in 2020, and it included more detailed investigation of water storage and management options for agriculture, further assessment of watershed health, a preliminary evaluation of environmental risk, and continued engagement with KFN and the community. And the final phase 2 plan, which James linked earlier in the chat there, was presented to the CVRD board and our Electoral Area Services Committee this past spring, with some recommendations on moving forward with a few of the priority action items identified in the plan. These included continued work with the KFN to develop a collaborative approach to watershed management for the Solemn watershed. Collaboration with Comox First Nation really played a key role in the development of the phase 2 report and will continue to play an important role moving forward. And there are many ways in which KFN and the CVRD can collaborate to support watershed health. And so it's been recommended that further discussions take place at the council, board, staff, and provincial levels to investigate and develop this collaborative approach. It was also recommended that the CVRD proceed with a watershed stewardship scoping study. So we know additional resources and capacity will really be required to support improved management and stewardship of the watershed and really move forward all of the recommended actions in the report. So this study work is intended to help investigate options for this improved service delivery and really recommend the best path forward. And this work will begin this fall. And I do recommend having a look at the report. There's a lot of important work that went into it and some really great recommendations and actions for moving forward. And with that, I'll head it back to Chris or over to Russell. Maybe.
Thank you very much, Derry and Chris. And next up is Tim Ennis.
Great, thanks very much, Russell. I'm just, if I may, I'm going to do my share screen thing here. And let's see if we can get the slideshow going. There we go. Does that work, Russell? Can you see the screen?
Yes, that's perfect now.
Wonderful, thank you. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to be able to speak with you today. So my thanks to Chris for inviting me to this conversation. I just wanted to start out by saying that I'm wearing my Comox Valley Land Trust hat today. I'm the executive director of the Comox Valley Land Trust. The Land Trust has two sort of main programs. One is a land securement program, which is fairly standard for land trusts, but the other is a bit of a unique creature called the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership. And it's that I'm going to be focusing on today as it relates to watershed stewardship here in our area. So the Comox Valley Land Trust, or sorry, the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership brings together over 26 different local ENGOs or non-governmental organizations, typically stream keepers groups, but also some ratepayers and residents associations into one common forum to discuss issues of common environmental concern. We then look for proactive opportunities to engage with Indigenous and local governments to bring about win-win conservation outcomes. We work primarily in the realms of policy development, provide science-based technical information, introduce best practices that are emerging from other jurisdictions, and many other similar activities. And of course, our individual members do so much more than that, with particular reference to hands-on stewardship projects, but also large land securement and restoration projects. So the CVCP is administered by the Comox Valley Land Trust, but our steering committee includes pretty much all of the larger ENGOs in the community, each represented by thousands of members and supporters. So our steering committee would include, for example, the Land Trust, but also Courtenay Fish and Game, Comox Valley Nature, Project Watershed, the Cumberland Community Forest Society, Mars, the Solemn River Restoration Society, and many more. The steering committee gets together and meets monthly to discuss the implementation of our strategic plan and to hear from each other as to current projects, priorities, or emerging concerns. So this structure helps to make sure that we are working with each other collaboratively as a sector, but it also provides, I think, a really convenient single portal of contact for governments, developers, or other interests as it relates to the stewardship sector. So that's here who we are. Our strategic plan that we have in place at the moment has 7 main priority areas, each with its own subordinate objectives and goals. And as you can see here, watershed protection is one of the many interconnected priorities that we have as a group. Our watershed protection priority area has 4 subordinate objectives to it. And so I'm going to briefly walk you through a few of the more recent successes that we as a partnership have had in each of these 4 areas. The first is protecting drinking water supply area. So this is a photograph of 130 hectares that was recently acquired from private timber company along both sides of Perseverance Creek and added to the Cumberland Community Forest in 2020. The land is further protected by a conservation covenant held by the Comox Valley Land Trust and others that specifically references a watershed protection zone. In respect to that zone, one of the key intentions in the covenant, and I'm just going to read from it here, is to protect, preserve, conserve, maintain, or restore the watershed protection zone to achieve hydrological and ecological integrity of the riparian area in support of water quality objectives. So pretty clear linkage. The Village of Cumberland is, of course, the owner of this land now and takes on the long-term management responsibility and cost. The CVRD was a very significant financial contributor to the acquisition from their water services budget, taking us back to the concept of the eco-asset valuation projects that Chris referenced earlier. So this latest piece now brings us to a total of over 200 hectares protected in this watershed. That's about 500 acres. And the role of the stewardship sector in this work has been really paramount, with the Community Forest Society leading the charge on land negotiations and fundraising, but also completing science-based assessments of the land. The Comox Valley Land Trust has provided technical support along the way and takes on the long-term trustee responsibility for the land. I would add that the Perseverance stream keepers have been fundamental in maintaining and restoring salmonid populations in the watershed, as well as collecting water quality data. And other CVCP partners, including Courtney Fish and Game, have provided financial support to the acquisition as well. Comox Valley Nature has provided native plants for site-specific restoration applications, and the Youth and Ecological Restoration Program has supported data collection that will inform land management. So the ENGO sector has brought some significant resources to the table in this example, both from private foundations as well as corporations and local businesses. These resources are not typically available to local governments. So we're able to bring real value to the table here. So we like to say, if you give us $10, we'll turn it into 30 or 40. This kind of direct land acquisition and watershed management work being led by ENGO partners is ongoing. Additional land acquisition is in the works currently in the watershed, being led by CVCP partners, supporting each other and working proactively in partnership with Indigenous and local governments. In terms of engagement with integrated watershed management, Chris did a great job of introducing the Watershed Advisory Group for the Comox Lake Watershed. The Conservation Partnership have been very active participants in that for many, many years. In fact, our members, 3 of them have legal interests registered on title in the watershed, so we have a role there. And as well, Comox Valley Nature has a ward and a relationship with the Comox Lake Bluffs Ecological Reserve in the area as well. So further, our partnership has been advocating for sort of a multi-jurisdictional and integrated East Comox Lake management plan that kind of brings together the landowners in the eastern portion of the lake. This is where most of the public access is focused, and most of the risk from, say, wildfire, for example, would probably originate. Rather than having each individual landowner create its own sort of management plan or regime for the area, we're proposing a more integrated approach so that there's consistent messaging, consistent signage, and a consistent view on public access to the area. So we look forward to moving forward with that, but of course would be, really wanting to make sure that we had the important contributions of the Comox First Nation involved in that as well. Another sort of significant priority area for us is engaging with eco-asset valuation approaches to watershed management. In 2017, the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership introduced the concept of eco-asset valuations to our community by way of a fairly large symposium, whereby we brought together some of the best minds in Canada on this topic and put them all together in the Philburg, back when we used to be able to do that kind of thing, for 2.5 days of focused discussion on this concept. And what we were hoping to do at the time was to create fertile ground in which we could plant some seeds for pilot projects that would, take this concept and put it down on the ground. But what we saw come out of it was actually even better. We noticed that every single local government in our community fully embraced this concept and planted their own seeds. So we've got 5 separate eco-asset valuation projects that have now either been completed or in process relating to watersheds in our community. This conversation was application to the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative to do an eco-asset valuation there, and Chris has mentioned that already. So the previous slides have highlighted, I think, many of the ways the CVCP and our members have worked towards this 4th objective as well. There's a lot more examples I could point to with more time, but I respect that we're limited on that today. So I'll just end by saying that the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership and our members really support working collaboratively with all levels of government, from KFN all the way down through federal, provincial, regional, municipal layers, as well as with industrial private landowners in our watershed to bring about positive outcomes for reliable, high quality drinking water for now and for future generations. So just a little thumbnail sketch of our activities for you today. And that's it for me. So thank you again for the opportunity to be with you all this afternoon. Thanks, Russell.
Great. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, Tim, Derry, Chris, and Candace. And I see that Candace has put in the chat the manual field visit data and the location of that online. So please check that out. Thanks for that, Candace. Now go to the group. Are there any questions, either by raise of your hand or input into the chat room? Any questions or comments? And I see Mayor Wells is the first up.
Thanks, Russell. Really appreciate it. And Tim, I just want to just a huge shout out for that Eco Asset Symposium. I got to be there with two hats on, and it was an amazing event. And glad to hear that all that work is continuing on. My question is really around all the data that's being collected, and we've got the Watershed Advisory Group and the Eco Asset groups, and when we were sort of talking with the Comox Lake watershed and kind of obviously all the forestry work that's being done there, but you know it's happening throughout all the watersheds. But how forthcoming are the forestry companies in sharing that data? My recollection is that they let CVRD staff go and visit and that kind of stuff. But I just wondered, is there free flowing information, or could that be better?
Thank you very much for the question, Mayor Wells, and I'll go to you, Chris Burrows, to provide a response.
Sure. Yeah. No, I wouldn't say the data is free flowing. We're actually working towards a memorandum of understanding between the CVRD and Mosaic, and hoping to make progress on that this winter. And that has been kind of held up as a bit of a barrier, not having the terms of data sharing properly articulated. So that is something that we're working towards. As you've highlighted, we're very grateful, and very appreciative of the unrestricted access that Mosaic and Hancock have provided to their lands for water quality monitoring and other study work within the watershed. So that's been excellent. In terms of sharing of their data, though, I mean, it's hard to we can't forget that they're working in a competitive environment. So that's often an explanation for why specific data sets can't be shared as freely as maybe we would like. But we are hopeful that with completion of this MOU in place with better defined terms for sharing and confidentiality of the information, that we can finally gain access to some of those larger data sets and at least make use of them in a kind of an aggregate form as part of the study work that we have underway in the watershed.
Thanks. Really appreciate the answer.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for the question, Mayor Wells. Please, others that are joining us today, if you have any questions or comments, please put up your hand or add them to the chat room. I have a question here from Chair Keller.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the staff can speak to the municipal asset initiative and whether current private mass forest lands are contributing to information about the valuation of the watersheds.
Sure. Yeah, so the kind of advisory group that I mentioned in my presentation that has been formed to help guide that process does have participation from both Mosaic and Hancock, which are the two largest forestry companies that operate within the watershed. So they are participating in the process. They have provided some information, and they're eager to review the draft language that we will have ready shortly or this winter. So they're eager and active participants in the process.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And any other questions or comments before we go on to the next section? We are running a little ahead of things here, so I hope that Julie and Kate, who are our next speakers, might be ready. We'll put them on deck and move along here, unless one last call for any questions or comments in this section. Great, don't hesitate to add them to the chat as we go along, because as things sum up here at the end, we can always go back. So our next and final section is learning from our neighbors. And you may or may not know this, but there are only 27 regional districts in the universe. And the billionaire space race is actually all about finding the 28th, but they haven't found it yet. The reason I raise this is that regional districts are very unique, and we are unique amongst each other, very different, but we have a great means of sharing and collaborating on initiatives and learning from each other how we tackle complex issues at all levels of staff throughout our organization. So I'm very pleased to announce or to introduce you today to two of the staff members. The first from the Regional District of Nanaimo is Julie Passani. She's the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program Coordinator for the Regional District of Nanaimo, and she's going to tell us about the initiative that they have there. And then we'll be followed by Kate Miller, the Manager of Environmental Services for the Cowichan Valley Regional District. So we can learn from our two neighbors on Vancouver Island. And please consider your questions or comments. This is our opportunity to see how other regional districts have advanced their management and consideration of water issues in their jurisdictions. And we'll start off with Julie.
Excellent. Thanks very much for the invitation to join the session today. I'll go ahead and share my screen, so just bear with me for a moment. Please let me know if you're seeing it here, and I'll switch over to presenter view if I can.
That's excellent, Julie. We've got it. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll dive in, recognizing I'll try and be an efficient storyteller for the past decade plus of work that we've done at the Regional District of Nanaimo with regards to our drinking water and watershed protection program. So to kick off with a bit of context about our region, we are within the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, a federation of 4 municipalities and 7 electoral areas. The RDN itself operates 9 small water systems within the electoral areas, and the municipalities operate the drinking water services for their residents, the largest of which being the City of Nanaimo's drinking water system, which draws water from the Nanaimo River, and the second largest being a shared system between City of Parksville and the Nanoose Bay Peninsula, which is RDN system that draws water from both groundwater and the Englishman River. And the remainder of the communities are reliant on groundwater for their drinking water supplies primarily. Now, this theme has already been raised in earlier presentations, but just, well, raise it again in terms of the way we look at our region is how water flows through the areas, not necessarily by the jurisdictional boundaries. So you'll see I've changed over the map that's on the slide here to show not only where the municipal and electoral area boundaries are, but we often, through our program, refer to water regions. So these are sort of high-level watershed areas, of which we have 7, and there's, of course, sub-watersheds within those 7 water regions. But that gives us a bit of a framework so that we can continue to converse and manage water on a regional watershed scale. And that is the role of the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program, which I'll get into a bit of the origin story here today. So the main driver around sort of the development of a program oriented around drinking water and watershed protection in the Regional District of Nanaimo was really hanging the hat on the concept that watersheds are assets. Healthy watersheds provide our communities with water supply, with ecosystem services, crucial habitat, cultural values, and recreation. But our watersheds are also under stress. So there's the jurisdictional complexity that comes along with the many overlapping interests and authorities within our watersheds, as well as limited resources if we look at any of these one agencies in isolation. Layer on top of that, the environmental stressors of climate change, of growing population, and land use change. There are also common goals, however, within all of our electoral area OCPs, as well as the municipal strategic plans that contain language about environmental protection, adequate water supply, and ensuring water quality. So essentially, this common language that occurs time and time again is around preserving and protecting water quality and quantity. So why regional investment? Well, really, it's around the understanding that our water sources are shared and we need to manage upstream and downstream impacts. So looking beyond just water service area boundaries to look more at the aquifer boundaries, the watershed boundaries. And that will in turn help us optimize service delivery. It will help us protect local assets. We're also very much focused on collecting regional information to inform land use decisions and water allocations. So this includes a role to advocate up to senior government. And overall, this investment at the regional level does help us to advance reconciliation with Indigenous communities who are, of course, rights and title to the lands and waters within the region. And by showing up as a long-term partner in these efforts, it positions the Regional District of Nanaimo very much as a long-term partner. So I'll go through the timeline of a little bit of how this unfolded in our region, the development of the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Service. So back in 2003, the RDN board identified drinking water and watershed protection as a priority in their strategic plan. By 2006, a stewardship committee was established for drinking water and watershed protection with the key task to develop a 10-year action plan along with a budget. Once the action plan was presented to our board and was adopted at the end of 2007, basically the question was, how are we going to enact the plan? How are we going to fund the implementation of all the actions contained within the plan? And so the decision was to go to referendum to ask the electorate if they would be willing to pay for a dedicated drinking water and watershed protection service, which would fund the action plan implementation through a parcel tax. So this referendum did succeed in 2008 by a narrow margin. I believe it was 54% at that time. And so that gave the go-ahead to establish a parcel tax funded service, which began implementation in 2009 with a full-time program coordinator. Next key milestone I'll mention is that by 2012, the 4 member municipalities were all partners within the DWWP function through servicing agreement. So it was established initially with just the electoral areas, but of course the long-term goal was to have it be regional, and this was attained in 2012 with all 4 member municipalities coming on board as well. And most recently, we have updated our 10-year action plan for the second decade of program actions for 2020 to 2030. So a little bit on program funding. So in 2008, as I mentioned, a referendum authorized up to $25 of parcel tax within the electoral areas. This was implemented initially in 2009 as a $10 parcel tax within the electoral areas. And then as the member municipalities came on board, this sort of phased it down to $8 across the board to pay into the service, whether you're an electoral area or a municipality. In 2020, corresponding with our updated action plan, the parcel tax increased to $12 to fund the additional scope within our second action plan. And we do have proposed upcoming increases to be rolled out in 2022 and then in 2023 to fund the delivery of the program through to its second decade at the end of 2030. So I'll speak a bit about our 2 action plans, first one and the second one. Initially, the action plan really was focused around 7 program areas. So public awareness and involvement, water resource inventory, monitoring, management of land use and development, watershed management and planning, management of water use, management of water quality, and adapting to climate change. These general themes were retained in our second action plan, but were really distilled to kind of 4 main thematic areas. So water awareness and stewardship, water information and science, and water-centric planning and policy support, all woven together by that common thread of water collaboration. Really, the mission is to provide regional leadership at the watershed scale to support water management, land use planning, community outreach, and advanced drinking water sustainability, climate adaptation, and healthy ecosystems. At a high level, these are some of the key actions within our action plan. And I'll draw your attention because it's come up so much in the earlier conversations around maintaining robust regional water monitoring networks. So we are able to maintain both groundwater as well as surface water monitoring networks, in large part by mobilizing the stewardship sector, by training and providing equipment, and then by inputting that local data into provincial databases. We're able to communicate that water information to decision makers and the public through regular reporting and engaging consulting professionals to provide that interpretation and analysis and trending. And importantly, this gives us the ability to facilitate the integration of that information into planning processes, not only at the local level, but further up to senior government levels as well. Now, I won't get into all our sub-actions, both new and continuing from the first and second decade, but just to give you an understanding of the breadth of the work that we do across all of these 3 main categories. And the key scope expansion for our second action plan really included the addition of rainwater management actions as outlined in our liquid waste management plan, as well as natural asset management with supporting data and inventory, appropriate staffing levels, enhanced monitoring and data management, and expanded funding for rebates and stewardship projects. So a little bit on our staffing structure. So through our parcel tax funded service, this gives us the ability to fund the wages of 4 permanent full-time staff, and we report to the water services manager. So myself as a drinking water watershed protection program coordinator, as well as 3 coordinators that work within the program, one that oversees our monitoring networks, another that supports the monitoring networks, but also does a lot around the rebate programs and on-the-ground stewardship, which is our stewardship coordinator, and our outreach coordinator, who's really focused on education and awareness programs in the community. We are also guided by a technical advisory committee that includes members, as I've listed here, some of which that have come up today in conversation, including Mosaic Forests, including some municipal partners, as well as ministries and so forth. And recently we have had the addition of Indigenous community reps added to our committee as well. And, through the technical advisory committee, we're able to pass along resolutions to the board. And that has sometimes translated into further advocacy and resolutions to either AVIC or UBCM accordingly. So getting close to time here, I could rattle off a number of challenges and successes, but I think I'll go straight to my next slide, which is just the key learnings here. So key learnings really that I've distilled from our past decade and more is really that political champions have been an important ingredient for success in sort of that initial decision to go to referendum to fund a service to really give us that long-term reliable funding. And this long-term reliable funding really magnetizes crucial partnerships with senior government, so with the different ministries, with stewardship groups, with Indigenous communities. Interdepartmental collaboration also is essential. This really requires an organizational identity that aligns with the values of drinking water and watershed protection beyond just a single department. And beyond working with stewardship groups, we're also utilizing consulting professionals and really demonstrating results through collaborative initiatives. And this builds long-lasting relationships that help us get the job done over a long term. And so I think moving forward, we'll need to really have continued emphasis on working with and supporting First Nations and co-managing water and land in the region. And that's just a high-level summary, and I welcome any questions. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Julie. I see there is a question in the chat and a raised hand. We're just going to hold off on those, and we're going to go to Kate first, and then we'll take questions and comments for you both. So thanks for that, and please stand by because there's a lot of interest in what you had to say. So we now go on to Kate.
Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to join this discussion. It's been incredibly interesting so far. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint, if I may. Let me know when you see it. If we can, in fact, there we are. And can you hear me? Seem to be sharing the wrong
I can hear you,
thing.
Kate, and right now we're looking at all the slides at the same time.
Excellent. We will change that. How's that?
There, super. We've
Okay.
got the preview of the next slide as well as the slide you're focusing on as well.
Okay.
See.
Do you want me to just maximize it to the 1 if I can do that?
Sure, that would probably be best. Thank you.
Do that. Maybe not. Sorry, we've had a little event at our office here, and I've got 3 giant screens in front of me. And
That's probably good to go with what you got there, as long as the print isn't too small. Yep, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So I think a little bit of a contrast to Julie's, a slightly different story in terms of how we approached it. So our new plan is called One Water, One Region, and you'll see on this particular slide that it's a fairly large region. Spanning multiple bioclimatic zones. We've got the very, very dry East Coast and the very wet West Coast for the most part, and obviously communities largely centered on the eastern side, but really throughout the area. Because of the size and some of the jurisdictional pieces with regards to the PMFL lands that were discussed earlier, very little information was available to us in the early 2000s to really start figuring out how do we approach some of the issues around water. Again, 9 electoral areas, 4 municipalities, and 10 First Nations with interest in the area that is beyond things like Mosaic or the Time Timber West and Island Timberlands, agricultural communities. We have a very large pulp and paper mill within the area and quite a bit of agriculture actually throughout the region, quite interestingly enough. We have 17 watershed groupings. Most of them are really quite distinct from each other in terms of their signatures and the stressors on those particular areas. We have 70% of it is in forestry, whereas noted earlier, we don't have a lot of jurisdiction in regards to the management of those lands, but our thinking at this point, some of the initial perspectives from our leadership was really, let's look at ownership or control of those watersheds. But I think we're really leaning to, we don't have capacity to manage our, parklands at this point, never mind, really actively manage forestry lands. So the focus is really on trying to determine what the key values are of those particular areas, particularly with regards to biodiversity and water, and perhaps use those values as performance metrics for the managers of those lands themselves. We have 45 water systems in the area, and that's both the CVRD, our municipal partners, but a very, very large proportion of the 45 are actually private utilities, which have a variety of asset management strategies. At this point, one of the major issues affecting our region is obviously water supply. And so that's been largely the focus of our work. There are 2 water plans that were in place prior to the establishment of the regional function. One was for the Cowichan watershed, and it has 97 recommendations within that particular plan, most of them outside of the purview of a regional district, things like updating provincial policy with regards to groundwater allocations and controls, those sorts of things. Looking at climate change, looking at flooding, looking at interdepartmental and interdisciplinary coordination and partnerships. A lot of that has been dealt with through the institutionalization of the Cowichan Watershed Board, which acts as a collaborative space. We also have a South Cowichan water management plan, which is really focused in the Shawnigan, Cobble Hill, Malahat area that focused on groundwater reserves. But at the time that plan was developed, we had no control whatsoever over groundwater use. So the history that we've approached about the same time as the Regional District of Nanaimo, 2003 to 2005, is the development of the plans, but really from a bottom-up approach, given that the Regional District didn't really have a specific role. We've developed or participated in the development of those 2 major plans. And at that point in time, when those plans were tabled, one of the plans actually went to referendum, the South Cowichan plan, which really looked at limits to growth and the fact that there was no additional available water resources that could be located or relied upon, and the Cowichan plan as well. So really the focus at that point became, what is it that we can actually do? And we sort of switched to an approach of working with community members, working with the ENGOs, working with partners and stewards to really try to talk about education, collect data, really build a narrative and a culture of caring for our watersheds. That allowed us and allowed our partners at the political level to really have space to be champions without necessarily going to a formal referendum and have formal roles other than champions and kind of the third party approach. So it was very soft, very lateral. And in some ways, it allowed us to be very, very tactical, right? So we could do things that didn't have the same type of timing that a local government would have. You could have a great idea and you could have it out on the street within hours in some ways. So that was fabulous. The challenge that we're having now is trying to rebuild that to a CVRD function and really build a space for kind of the CVRD process, the institutional infrastructure that's required. So moving really from a whole series of projects to formal programs. And so we've got a fairly large challenge, and that is rebranding our role as the CVRD from supporter of ENGOs and community groups to kind of the central doer, where in the past we had been funding them to collect data. We now actually want to have institutionalized data collection, those types of activities. So again, tons of public consultation over the last 15 or so years around these types of issue. Again, working with provincial government, particularly in the area of water allocation. So for our region, if you look at that larger region and where most of the development is, it's on the East Coast, and there is no additional water for allocation in the South Cowichan area. The Coxswain is over allocated, the Cowichan is over allocated, the Chemainus is over allocated, and we are also looking at likely over allocation around the Nanaimo and the Yellow Point areas. So very, very challenging discussions ahead of us, and there was some conversation about the Coxswain and the pulling back of licenses. We've also been working quite a bit with our region's First Nations, and so there's ongoing consultation. We don't anticipate that consultation is ever going to stop. It's going to be part of a long-term relationship and learning process, largely on our side in terms of what does watershed stewardship mean, what are the needs of the communities, and what does it mean with regards to rights and title and accommodation. So that's something that's extremely exciting and is being led at this point in time, largely by the province and Cowichan tribes in terms of saying, well, what does this mean, particularly for fisheries and for traditional needs and uses of the various watersheds. Again, stewardship groups, we've committed through our program to continue to provide backbone support to the stewardship groups. So while we have a program and we now have a function, we don't have the same type of capacity that the RDN has, insofar as we need to work with others to largely put this information into play. The sort of the reality of the water purveyors is quite delicate, particularly since we are at threshold, and it's a space with a lot of competition because it's driving, for our region in particular, issues with regards to growth and development. And so it's a privatized system and there's opportunities there for them. Again, we're also working with CVRD organizational units, and this is quite dynamic. As of last week, we are restructuring again. So my group and the drinking water program is inside of the engineering department, and we will be moving to the planning and development group shortly. But we continue to work with our local government partners. One of the things that we all agreed upon, I would say about 5 minutes into the conversation, is where we should focus our efforts. quite a bit of the expectation was that we would be really focusing on planning and advocacy and stewardship types of pieces out to the larger community. But I think the group quickly realized that we actually needed to have much better information in order to do that effectively. And so the bulk of our work is in developing the data, information, and knowledge bundle within the program itself. So for example, we now have a regional and approved drinking water and surface water quality monitoring program that the board is committed to funding. We're in the midst of developing a regional climate and hydrometric and emergency warning system where we're hoping to have the outputs of that analysis a little later on this winter, early spring, and that will drive the investment in establishing groundwater, surface water monitoring networks that will be linked to our 911 system so that we'll be able to get that data consistently over time. Lots of discussion about whether or not that should be uploaded to the provincial network, or in fact, some of the data that we want is going to be a little bit more nuanced, and so we may decide to warehouse it ourselves. So that's still in discussion. So again, our program is really focused on long-term watershed planning, looking at what are the outputs, why do we want this information? We want to make sure that our communities develop in an appropriate fashion, that we protect the ecological and physical resources requirement for that system to function effectively in the long term. That means that we spend a lot of time and a lot of thought on the new normal process, which is really our climate change projections and the regular kind of review of that to see whether or not we are building out our communities and developing infrastructure in order to protect those resources. And an example there would be the long-term strategies with regards to water supply for the Cowichan system and the eventual building of the Cowichan Lake Weir to provide long-term water. We were close to pulling the trigger on having the pumps go in again this summer to provide ongoing water into the river to allow the fisheries to come up and to support sewage dilution, all of those sorts of things as well. We're updating our official community plans. We don't have a regional growth strategy, which obviously is a bit of a challenge when we're looking at trying to live within ecological bounds. So this information helps to provide background information with regards to development requests, etc. We're also in the process of completing a liquid waste management plan for the South Cowichan area. We'll be going back to the central area and are probably going to be focusing on the development of a Western liquid waste management plan as well. So obviously both water and sewer treatment are intertwined with the ability of the ecosystem to assimilate those wastes, but also to provide the necessary water. So long-term monitoring strategies for both the hydrometrics and water quality. Ongoing First Nations communities input into, even the notion of what does water quality mean? Is it just physical and chemical parameters, or really is it about what is water and what's the sense of water? So lots of really interesting discussions in that particular area. Again, we have a very, very large area and we've got limited funding. So the investments in this program are really focused on the sort of the backbone infrastructure that we need, but also the risk assessments. So areas that are deemed to be at higher risk are obviously going to be on the higher priority for investments. So how we spend funds, we've got limited funds, as I said, so we went to referendum. You'll see at the bottom bullet there, we went with assessed value as opposed to parcel tax. So it's 750,000 or the greater of those two figures. The program is approved and we had approval for a staff position. There is no designated staff for this program at this point in time. It's off the corner of my desk largely, but we do have renewed approval by the board for hiring of a staff position to maintain this particular program. We continue to have strategic partnerships. Probably the largest one would be the Cowichan Watershed Board, who acts as an intermediary between ourselves and Cowichan tribes, but also between us and the community with regards to the long-term requirement for raising water levels at the lake. Obviously, we have to leverage as much as we possibly can. So that is with the ministries and academic organizations, etc. We have decided to, we had been funding community organizations to do field work and water quality work. However, we've decided that based on the quality of the data, we needed to bring that back in-house, but we are continuing to fund community organizations to take on some of the other necessary work where appropriate, and we're still trying to figure out how best to do that. So again, we've got one goal, not lots of goals, 6 objectives. Tried to keep it linear as much as possible in 3 particular program areas: learning, acting, and sharing. So the focus on the science, the focus on taking that science and putting it into action within our land use plans and our infrastructure plans, and then sharing and collaborating with the community at large. 14 priority action areas. I think we've gone over quite a few of them already, but sort of this ongoing characterization of both surface and groundwater, and then communicating those impacts out in a very adaptive fashion. One of the challenging pieces is obviously with that original growth strategy and our various municipal partners and First Nations partners is how are we going to have those discussions about limits to growth or limits to the extraction of a resource when many communities need that. So it's going to be a very, very active area for discussion as we go forward. We already know that's the case if you look at both the Cowichan, the Coxsila, and the Chaninas areas. And then 4 guiding principle. It's partnership, action-oriented, it's adaptive, and it really is based on performance standards and KPIs. We need to be very, very visible to the public. So the priorities are right now are program staffing, implementing the approved water quality monitoring strategy. We're in the process of developing a groundwater monitoring strategy and a data management strategy. It's nice to say we want lots of information, but we need to be very clear about how we're going to manage that information. How do we deal with issues around privacy and FOIs? What does that look like in time, particularly if we're asking for data from third-party sources, such as Mosaic? How do we manage that data in a way that is useful to us, but also protects their needs as well? So the hydrometric monitoring strategy is also linked to a long-term climate monitoring strategy. Continue the work with the stewardship groups. We built with SNC Lavalin a predictive, adaptive risk management module. So to continue to update that current state of information within the model itself. Updating the official community plans and the modernization process. We've now got separate community plans for each of our electoral areas and municipalities, but we're talking about an amalgamated one in all likelihood. And then establishing the technical advisory committee for the program itself. And one of the things that we've talked to Julie and others about is perhaps having a Vancouver Island advisory committee with provincial representatives so that we're not duplicating effort and then working within the sphere of each of those groups' particular objectives. So I was really happy to hear that that's one of the processes that they are also proposing. So the Cowichan water supply issue, I've also separated that out. That's really sort of in parallel to the drinking water program, but we are working on a very, very aggressive engineering and environmental impact analysis, and hopefully the capital works for the program itself to be rolled out within the next 3 years once we go through the official licensing process. So again, just to reiterate the 3 program areas, watershed science, the monitoring systems themselves, data management systems, how we're going to address that, particularly the early warning for both long-term water and bulk water supply, but also flood management within our systems. Looking at the characterization of the watersheds and the identification of risk. And so every community has a different sense of what is risk and what's tolerable. So really it's community-based pieces, but so we'll do the science, but also the kind of the human context piece about what is special and how do we actually protect that within the ecological health characteristics, or maybe their visual or beauty characteristics. But there are those kinds of discussions that are going on as well. The water budget piece is absolutely critical, and so I've separated that out from the ecological and the watershed's health kind of piece, but it's really around trying to understand what the limits to the resource are in a way that we have never done before. And this will help drive requirements for future conservation needs. The water-centric planning piece is obviously how do we coordinate policy frameworks, both within our municipal and jurisdictional pieces within our region, but also can we be providing adaptive and strategic feedback to the province with regards to their policies so that we don't have conflicts, for example, with MOTI around drainage needs or those sorts of things. So that's an ongoing piece. So again, the 3rd program area is really around long-term, putting it on the ground, communicating back out to the public. Obviously, we need appropriate staffing and resources to do this effectively. So we hope to get there within the next 2 to 3 years to be able to have information that we can communicate out effectively, as opposed to simply going to the public and saying, we've got problems, we don't know how we're going to address them, but these are some very specific ways in which you can help us to address these problems, and this is what we're doing. So I think that's a summary of my reality here within the regional district itself. It's a little different than Julie's insofar as we're now kind of reframing it as the regional district, and hopefully we will have staffing in place come January. We'll just hounding HR to see when we're posting, so that's where we are at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, Julie. Quick question to you, Kate. Your slides, are those mostly from a single document that's available from your website that people can refer to?
Absolutely. I can. We've got a number of things going on. We had a major flood in our office, and so right now I'm still working on cardboard boxes and the temporary flat space, but we also have failing servers, and so our priority right now is to move all of our documents on our servers to a new server system, and I'm hoping to, once we finish that, we will be doing a complete revamp of our website, but I'm more than happy to send you the 10-year strategy, the sort of the public facing documents for you to share if you like.
Okay, excellent. And for everyone's knowledge, today's presentations, we will make those available to you at a later date as we compile them, but the PowerPoints that you saw today will be made available, as well as any links that are passed on to us. So thank you for that. I'll just quickly go to the chat. We got last few minutes because I know some of you have meetings or otherwise to go to today. And I'm going to try and wrap this up by shortly, a few minutes after 4:30. So if you can hang on with us. Jake, we'll just go through some of the chat comments and questions. Alex Allen asked, what other rebates beyond water meters does the RDN offer? Are there rainwater harvesting or rain barrel rebates? And then I think later on, the question was responded to by Julie. She states the RDN offers rebates for rainwater harvesting, cisterns, 1,000 imperial gallons, wellhead upgrades, well water testing, irrigation, soil improvements. These are offered region-wide for EA and municipal residents. And I'm assuming those are for those that are in water service areas or outside. Is that correct, Julie?
That's right, either inside or outside. So on a well or on a system, you can apply for rebates region-wide.
Okay.
So
But just not available to the Cowichan Valley and the Comox Valley.
that's right.
Not yet. Great. Thank you so much. And also thank you for the link to your rebates so people can refer to that as well. And then Director Hamir asked for both the reps. Are there limits to growth that are being considered in areas where water allocation is overcommitted? Maybe go to you, Julie, because that was an issue that you faced this summer, whether that's under consideration. And I think you have a reply there, but maybe you would be quicker to answer.
Sure, certainly. In the interest of time, I was trying to respond in the chat so we could get to all the questions. But yeah, essentially the short answer is the information we collect and the analysis that we do on water availability in the region, we funnel that both internally to our long-range planning department, who will be able to use that information for planning decisions related to official community plan updates, to implementing any rezoning applications or regional growth strategy amendments. And on the ground, what that looks like in some cases is the provision for development permit areas that require for aquifer protection, that require rainwater harvesting, that require certain proof of water, as well as water conservation measures. So I framed it not necessarily as limits to growth, but that growth can proceed if these measures are taken for reducing water demand, providing extra storage, and proving that your wells on site can, in the first place, meet the minimum requirements. And then a key piece is that the information is also sent to the province, where water availability information can inform water license decisions. So to kind of avoid the over allocation in the future in other systems. So we're basically taking the role of saying, you know, you're making those allocation decisions at the provincial level, but it's our role at the regional level to make sure there's sufficient information to inform those decisions that have a really big impact on our region.
Great, thank you so much. And I see you have provided some links, and everybody that where there has links been provided through the chat will ensure that our follow-up to you after this forum, those links are made available to you. I'll now go to Director Arbor Grieve, the twin-headed directors from the regional district, and you have a question, one of you or both of you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, we've been chatting, both of us, through the presentations, and really impressed by the work of our two regional districts to the south. It does feel like, I feel like we're back in 2003 over here, and in the sense of the journey of the RDN and the discussions around creating drinking water and watershed protection service specific to, well, the entire electoral areas at first, and then the municipalities. In the regional district here, we've been pretty focused on Comox Lake so far in terms of watershed protection. So really hopeful that there's models we can explore. And I guess my question is, we're not quite at the stage where we're going to require rainwater capture as part of the building code or anything like that, but especially for Julie at the RDN, having this water service and with the experience of this summer, do you think that has awoken more urgent need or new actions that may be considered in the future that were not envisioned even a year ago? Or you think you had all bases covered and you were going to move forward as usual?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, no, I think we subscribe to the concept of adaptive management, of like, we don't have it figured out just because we have an action plan. We're just constantly learning as we go and adapting our approach as new information comes in, as we experience kind of climate change in real time, and try to utilize that in our program implementation. So I think the main things moving forward is really, and this is where actually I can have a nod to our neighbors to the north in the Comox Valley in terms of the natural assets. And that is, I really think, think, an emerging sort of next step in how in our region we're looking to kind of quantify water availability, but also quantify our resilience to climate change impacts, to resilience to drought and to flood and everything in between. And so I think a piece that we have underdeveloped, but it's part of our sort of next 10 years priorities, is really looking at that inventory of watershed natural assets and how that contributes to our resilience in terms of water storage. So it's not just the engineered infrastructure of dams, although that's important. And it's not just like the highly decentralized, rain barrels and cisterns in people's backyards, although that is important as well. But it's that whole spectrum of also the intact riparian areas, preserving the wetlands, looking at seasonally flooded parkland and seasonally flooded agricultural fields and the role that that plays in, say, flood management. So I think that's sort of the big takeaway, is that there's no one solution to our water issues. We have to look at it really as this palette of all these different tools at our disposal. And I think if we continue to look at our watersheds as living entities, that we're learning from them, and we can kind of take those observations and reflect that in our local government planning, that would probably be a big takeaway for all of us.
Thank you very much. And Kate, any last comments on some of those questions that have been asked?
I think maybe just one additional piece there is that we really, we were really focused on the riparian piece and the surface water characteristics is a very visible piece. But we found that when we started to look at a lot of our areas, it's really groundwater. We don't have these sort of the traditional, watershed with storage and a main river sorts of things. And so not forgetting the value of surface groundwater interaction zones. And we found that those were being developed much more rapidly than areas that we could visibly see, or that people point to and say, well, we shouldn't develop that because it's a wetland. But 90% of the infiltration zones had been developed and hardened. And so really trying to get a handle on that if you're spending time on the natural capital piece is to try to identify those critical areas for groundwater recharge and putting them on as a high priority item to address.
Great, thank you both. And just want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of compliments to our presenters today as people have added to Zoom. An example, Jesus Rempel, just her parting comment, there's a lot of information and great ideas from today's work, and by working together, we can make good progress in management and protection of water. So thank you for passing those comments on. Well, now for closing remarks, just pass you on to our Chair Kettler. Thank you.
Thank you. So we heard a lot about different water services in the Comox Valley and beyond, and the challenges of maintaining both water quality and quantity. Some of those challenges included increasing demand, climate change and unpredictability, honoring First Nations right and title, difficulty of maintaining multi-jurisdictional nature of watersheds, and others. So hopefully you're feeling well informed about the current status of water in the valley and have some ideas on how to improve water management in your area. Some ideas that we heard today were increasing and consolidating data collection, implementing roundtables, advocating for changes to provincial legislation, moving toward natural asset management, and continuing public education. I believe there is an urgency to this work, especially as it pertains to protecting drinking water supply areas. And I hope that we can continue this conversation offline. But for now, I would like to sincerely thank our presenters today for their insights and thank all of you for your interest and participation today. Enjoy your afternoons.